Okay, so today we're going to be looking at a system monitoring tool by the name of Glances. It's not just a local system monitor, it'll also let you monitor remote systems as well, which I think is pretty cool. So Glances can operate in supposedly 3 different modes. I'll talk about why I say supposedly in just a bit, but those modes are Standalone Mode, which is basically where it's going to run locally on your system and only you can see it. Then you've got Web Browser Mode, where basically you have the same information, but it's going to be in your web browser, and you can also remote into other systems using that method. And then you also have Client Server Mode, where on the remote system you set up a server that will basically keep track of all the information, and then you should be able to view that information from a separate client. So we'll first start off with Standalone Mode, because that'll let us see what the tool actually looks like. So there's going to be a problem when it comes to actually zooming in, but I'll zoom in for now, just so you can have a bit of a better view of what's at the top, because as you're going to see, this application makes heavy usage of a modern size screen. So if we zoom out a bit, as you're going to see, we keep getting a bit of extra information, and I think that's everything now. So if I try to zoom in, we're going to lose these sensors down the bottom here, but for now, while we're looking at stuff at the top, I will zoom in just so it's a bit easier for you guys to actually read. So this section in the center is very reminiscent of another application by the name of HTOP, which is a process manager. And if you've ever used HTOP, it's pretty easy to understand what's going on in this center bit right here. It's pretty much the same information. It's laid out in a slightly different way. But if you do understand what's going on in HTOP, understanding what's happening in this center section right here is pretty straightforward, I would say. Now, as for the rest of the stuff up here, up the top here, we have my IP address on my local network, and then we have my public IP address. And then over to the left here, we have my CPU usage, my memory usage, and my swap usage. Now, unlike HTOP, which I'm going to be comparing this to fairly frequently just because they look fairly similar, in HTOP we have the individual core usages, whereas in Glances we only have a general CPU usage. But for me at least, this isn't really that big of a deal, and we do have some extra information about the CPU, most of which I don't particularly understand. I know this is obviously the system usage of the CPU, and this is the user usage, and that is basically how much of the CPU is idle. But I'm not sure what the rest of this stuff is, like nice, IRQ. IO wait, I presume, is the percentage of time that the IO is waiting, but I'm not entirely sure. And then moving on from that, the memory usage and the swap usage is also expanded upon. So we have the total memory, the used memory, and the free memory, as well as the active, inactive, buffers, and cached. And then for swap, it's basically just total, used, and free. And right now, I'm not using up any of my swap. And then there seems to be a bit of extra information for the CPU as well, which I don't particularly understand. This seems to be CPU load, but it's definitely not percentage used, so I'm not entirely sure what this number actually represents. So moving on from that to something I do understand is my network usage. So basically this right here is my wired Ethernet card. So right now that is a USB to Ethernet adapter. There's a long story why I'm using that instead of my Ethernet port, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So if I go turn on my Wi-Fi, what you're going to see is an extra device actually pops up here. So give it a second, and there we go. So WLP4SO. So that is my Wi-Fi card. But if I go and turn this back off again, it should go and disappear. So as you can see, that's now gone and disappeared. Now the reason why these values are actually changing right now is because I actually have a peer-to-peer application running in the background. So I've got library open right now. So as long as this application's open, there's just going to be a little bit of network usage going on in the background. Plus I might have some sort of torrent seeding or something like that. So because of that, there's going to be some sort of action going on my network. And then moving on from that, we have the TCP connections to this system. And then we have my disk IOs. So in here, it lists out every single one of your drives and every single one of your partitions. So in this case, I've got 3 drives, my NVMe 0 and 1, my SDA, and SDB. So this drive right here is basically my boot drive. This drive has my bootloader on it, it has my root partition, and it also has my swap space on it. And the SDA drive here is basically my home partition. So this is a 2 terabyte hard disk. And then basically I've just given the entire thing to my home partition. And then the third drive here is my Windows drive, but we're not going to go into that one today. And I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit now. And as you can see here, we've got my file system. So this basically tells you where stuff is actually located and how much is being used up. So as you can see, NVMe 0N1P3, that is my root partition. And then also my home is on SDA1. And right now that's used up 749 gigs. And then below that, we have various system sensors. So I think the edge is my GPU temp. Then this is my GPU fan speed. and the rest of these I believe are for my CPU. So while other system monitors might show this in maybe a bit more of a neater way where everything isn't on your screen at one time, maybe by using tabs or various other means like this, if you just want everything on your screen and you just want to see it in your terminal, Glances is a pretty good choice to use. But this isn't the only way that Glances can be used. As I said, there's also a web browser mode. So if we just run Glances -w and then give that a second to load up, what it's going to do is basically open up this web interface at this URL right here. So if we click on this link right here, what it's going to do is open up my web browser and basically show us the exact same information that we just saw before. So CPU usage, memory usage, network usage, various other things in here. I'm not going to go back over this. It's pretty much the exact same information that we just saw before. And also you can actually click on these to sort them. Now I think there's a way to sort them from the terminal, but I don't know the key for it. Anyway, the other thing you can do is, because it's in a web browser, they can show every single one of the processes at once. So if you scroll all the way to the bottom, as you're going to see, we can see every single process that's currently running on this system. Now, if you know anything about networking, you know that 0.0.0.0 is the address for the local host. So if you have this address here, you're not actually going to be able to connect to this system from a separate system. So what you have to do is run this along with a separate option. So if we just run Glances-w and then pass in the -B option, this will let us set an IP address. And this IP address just needs to match the IP address that your system has on the local network. So if we just run IP address, we'll see that the IP address of this device is 192.168.0.21. So if we just run that, so Glances-w -B 192.168.0.21, and we can also set a separate port for it. So by default, the port is set to 61,208. But if you have some various other application that's running on the same port, maybe something like transmission could clash with it, or a game server or something like that, in that case, what you can do is run the -p option and then go and set the port. So go and look online about the acceptable port range to use, just so you don't try and clash with something like HTTP. So I'm just going to run it with the -B option and then pass in this IP address. And what you're going to see happen is it's going to open up basically at that IP. Now, if I click on this, we're going to see the exact same thing. And it's no different from what we had before. So what happens if we try to set it with the wrong IP address? Let's set it to something like 22. What it's going to do is it should error out. So as you can see, basically it's going to say, I can't assign this address. Now, what if we type in an IP address, not for our system, but for a different device? So over to the side here, I've got my laptop running Glances, and that will be at 192.168.0.16. So let's just bring that open. So if we just run this link right here, as you're going to see, it opens up Glances, and this looks a little bit different to what we had before. Because as you can see, CPU usage is way higher than what we had. On my system right now, it's only at 25%, but on this one, it's at 51%. Also, the IP address up here is slightly different. The memory usage is also greater, and also it's running off of Wi-Fi. So this right here is my laptop, and it has a bunch of other weird things on it. Like I have Snap installed on it, so I have a bunch of loopback devices. I hate that Snap does this, but yeah, it's great. And also, yeah, you can see them here as well. You have a bunch of loop devices because Snap is horrible and it likes to set up lots of loop devices. And we also have some information about my CPU cores and various other things like that. Now, I don't know what's going to happen if you try to run Glances from a VM. I don't know what it's going to do for, say, like the system sensors and stuff, because these hardware sensors are going to differ from what you're actually passing into the VM. So I don't know how that would behave. I haven't actually tested that out. If someone wants to test that in the comment section down below and let me know what happens, feel free to do that. Now, when you're running Glances in web browser mode, what it's actually doing is setting up a REST API. And this REST API is actually available for you to query as well. So this can be done with various things like JavaScript, Python, or whatever you want to use. But we're going to be doing it with Perl. So if we have a look at the documentation for the REST API, so we can see what one of the endpoints is. One of the endpoints is this one right here. So the memory endpoint. What this is going to do is list out all the information about the memory. So if we just run this here, so if we just run this one here, but modify it just a tad, modify it so instead of doing localhost, we're using the IP address of my laptop because I don't feel like rerunning the web server on this device. So change this over to 192.168.0.16. And as you're going to see, it lists out all of the information about the memory on my laptop. So we have things like the total memory, the available memory, the percentage used, the used amount, so on and so forth. So there's basically an endpoint for every single piece of information that's being shown over here. So we've also got things like the plugin list, which is basically the information that's being shown. You can show information about a specific plugin, so about the memory plugin, about whatever plugin you want to see, and other things as well. So just feel free to come have a look through the REST API for this application if you want to query it through something like curl or various other tools like that. So before I get to client-server mode, there is a couple other things I do want to talk about, and the first one I want to talk about is the export stats options. So with Glances, what you can do is actually export to various tools. So you can export to a JSON file, you can export to CSV, or you could even export to various database formats. Now, I'm not going to go into the database stuff today, but there will be a link to the documentation down below if you do want to go see how to do that. I'm just going to be exporting out to JSON and CSV just because that's something I can do locally on my system. But with the documentation, there's actually a slight problem with it. So this is how it shows to do the export for JSON, but there's a problem here, and that is this part right here. So what you're going to do is -- export JSON, so you're setting the export type, and then the second option is basically setting where you want that JSON to be saved to. So what it's saying here is that the JSON is going to be exported to a file called JSON, and then this path right here is basically going to make the application crash. So if we run it like this, as you're going to see, throws an error. What you're supposed to do is get rid of this part right here. So hopefully someone goes and updates the documentation about that, because that was a little annoying when I saw that. But anyway, now if we run this, you're not really going to see anything happen inside of the application, because what it's doing is, as the application's running, every single update of the application is going to print out to that file. So now that it's updated a couple of times, let's just quit out of this and go into that file. So the file was called glances.json, and as you can see, there's 3 updates, so there's 3 lines in here. And each of these lines are actually very long lines, because what it is every single API endpoint you would have seen in the REST API basically compacted into a single line. So even though there's technically only 3 lines in here, there's quite a lot more data than you would expect. And then the way that you do a CSV export is pretty much the same way, but instead of doing JSON in here, what you do is you just replace the instances of JSON with CSV. So change this to CSV, and then change this one right here to CSV, and then change this one right... I guess we don't need to technically change this one. We'll just change it over to CSV anyway, and we run this now. And as you're going to see, once again, the application doesn't really show that anything's happening. But if we quit out of this now that it's updated a few times, what you're going to see is we go down to Glances, and there's glances.csv, and that's going to try to open up LibreOffice. Of course it is. Anyway, give that a second. Basically, we have a long line of every single bit of information in the application. So this should probably give you a good idea of how much was actually in that JSON file. So I'm just gonna keep scrolling until we, get to the end. There's quite a lot of information here. So all of this in the JSON version was on a single line. So there is a man page for Glances, but I'd recommend just going to the online documentation, just because that's going to get updated quicker, and also because it's just a bit easier to navigate. So under the anatomy of the application section, which will be linked down below, we can see all of the different, I guess they're called plugins in this application. Basically, it's the different sets of information that you can see. So let's say we wanted to see the information about the CPU. And under here, what you're going to see is we can see the CPU user, which is the percentage of time spent in user space, CPU system, CPU idle. So if you want to access any of these variables, it's basically the section you're under, dot the name of the variable. So CPU.user, CPU.system, CPU.idle, CPU.nice, so on and so forth. Or we can look at something like, is disk IO well described? I'm not sure. No, disk IO is one of the ones that's pretty poorly described. So as you can see, some of these, it doesn't actually show you what the variables actually are. So for those ones, it's a little bit annoying to work with, and I would like to see the documentation for this, I guess, be properly updated to reflect what the variables are actually called, or at least how you can find out about the variables. Because if they're being generated by the names of the hardware, then there should at least be some logic to how they're being described. So that should still be included in this section right here. But at this stage, it's not. And for a lot of things, it's also not included. So I think pretty much CPU and memory are the only ones that are properly described. A lot of them in here are kind of lacking in their documentation. So finally, we have client-server mode, and this is the mode that's making me say there's supposedly 3 different modes, because I haven't got client-server mode to actually work. So on my laptop right now, I've got the server version of Glances working. Basically, the way you start up the server is you run Glances-S, and then you also can set the IP address. And once again, I've set it to 192.168.0.16, and that's running just fine on my laptop. And the way that you connect to that is basically you do Glances-C, and then you pass in the IP address you want to connect to. So 192.168.0.16, and then also the port you want to connect to. So in this case, it's 61,209, and we run this now, and nothing happens. It just flashes, and then nothing happens. So I'm not sure if I'm doing something wrong. Once again, the documentation basically just says run the server on one device, run this command on the other device, and it'll connect. But it doesn't seem like anything's happening, so I don't know if I'm doing something wrong and it's just not documented properly, or if it doesn't work, or what's happening here. And there's another command you can run called Glances-browser, and what this is going to do is it should list out every single server that's currently available on your network. And as you're going to see, it's scanning my network, and it's going to find nothing. So I don't know what's happening here. So I can even run it locally on my system. So if we do Glances-S, and then we just try to run Glances-browser over here, as you're going to see, this is still not going to find anything. So I don't know what the deal is there, if it just doesn't work, or if I'm doing something wrong and it's not documented. If you know how to get this to work properly, feel free to let me know down below, but from what I can see, it doesn't seem to work right now. And while I'm complaining about stuff, what are these option names right here? So to disable IRIX, I don't know if that's supposed to be set IRIX or something like that, I'm not sure. Anyway, you can either do --disable -IRIX or -0. And then -1 is -- per CPU, or -2 is disable -left -sidebar. Why do you have numbered options? And they don't seem to be in the same sort of category. They're just numbered options for no reason whatsoever. I'm not sure why those are here. These should either be removed or given proper names. I don't know why you would ever have numbered options like this. So to end off the video, we're just going to have a look at the installation process. So when you install Glances, it actually has a ton of optional dependencies. So pretty much when you run it, the only thing you're really going to be able to do is run it in standalone mode. You'll be able to run the client server, and you'll be able to basically output to Json and CSV, but you won't be able to do web browser mode, and client server doesn't seem to work anyway, so you're going to need something to replace that. So for the optional dependencies, as you can see, there is a massive list in here. The one you're going to need for web server mode, though, is Bottle. So Bottle can be downloaded with pip. I don't know if it's in any standard repos. You can get it with pip, though. So this is a Python application, so if you don't like Python applications, well, you're kind of stuck there. But as for other stuff, there's also things like Bernhard for Ryman export module, or you can have Docker support, or you can have Elasticsearch support, and there's a bunch of other neat ones in here as well. So if any of this stuff, I guess, catches your attention, so this one right here, you can have RAID support. So if you have a RAID setup and you want to show that within Glances, you'll basically have to go and install this optional dependency, or for other ones like the GPU plugin and various other things in here as well. So if you just want the basic usage of Glances, feel free to just go and download it regularly, but otherwise you'll need some of these optional dependencies. Now, as for actually installing it, it's available in most distro standard repos. So on Arch Linux, you can just go pacman-s Glances, and that'll install it like that. Or you can run the install script here if you really want to, or you can install it with pip. Now, if you're going to install it with pip, you can also install the optional dependencies alongside the actual installation. So if you do pip install Glances and then start passing in the things you want to actually download along with it, then you can download those alongside it. Otherwise, if you install it with something like Pacman, what you're going to have to do is go download the optional dependencies afterwards, which isn't really that big of a deal. It's just something you have to keep in mind. So overall, I would say Glances is a really cool tool, even though the client server mode I can't seem to get working. The web server mode is generally going to be good enough to monitor remote systems, and if I wanted to have my own sort of interface for it, because I have access to the REST API, what I can do is just build up my own interface around it. So for me, that's honestly good enough. So I think that's everything I wanted to talk about today, but before I go, I want to thank my patrons. So a special thank you to Joachim Craig, Nathan, Andrew, Montezar, Peter D. Road, Tony Donald, and Zilva. If you want to join the Patreon, there'll be a link to that down below, as well as my Amazon affiliate links where you can buy the gear in this channel, or anything else you want, and I'll get a small kickback for it. Also, remember to check out my podcast. That is Tech of a Tea, available on Library and YouTube, and the audio version available wherever you listen to audio podcasts. Also, remember to check out this channel, available on Library, BitTube, and BitChute. And remember to smash the like button and leave me a comment down below. And remember to subscribe and ding the little bell icon down below as well. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.